Arthur Hutchinson, born 19th February 1941 in Hartlepool, County Durham, is an English criminal who gained notoriety for committing a triple murder in Sheffield, South Yorkshire, in October 1983. He remains in prison and has mounted multiple legal challenges to overturn his life sentence. Before the murders, Hutchinson had already spent over 5 years in prison for the attempted murder of his half-brother Dino. He also had several prior convictions for sexual offences. On the 28th of September 1983, he was arrested on suspicion of theft, burglary, and gape. During the arrest, he attempted to escape from Selby police station by jumping out of a window, injuring his knee on barbed wire. After evading capture for 3.5 weeks, Hutchinson broke into the home of the Leitner family in Dorey, Sheffield, late on the 23rd of October 1983. Inside, he murdered Basil Leitner, 59, his wife Avril, 55, and their son Richard, 28, by stabbing them to death. He then gaped their 18-year-old daughter, Nicola, at knife point. The family had only hours earlier hosted the wedding reception of their other daughter, Suzanne. Investigators believe Hutchinson may have originally intended to commit a robbery. Hutchinson was identified through a combination of evidence, including a description given by Nicola Leitner, a palm print left on a champagne glass, and a dental impression left on a block of cheese. He remained on the run for 2 more weeks, moving through Barnsley, Nottinghamshire, Manchester, York, and Scarborough, until being captured on a farm in Hartlepool on the 5th of November 1983. Police were able to trace him through a phone call he had made to his mother. Hutchinson's trial began in September 1984. During proceedings, he accused a Sunday Mirror reporter, Mike Barron, of committing the murders, but the jury rejected this claim. After deliberating for 4 hours, the jury found him guilty of the 3 murders and the gape of Nicola Leitner. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a recommended minimum term of 18 years, which could have allowed parole in 2002 if deemed safe. However, the Home Secretary, Leon Britton, imposed a whole life tariff, ensuring Hutchinson would never be released. Hutchinson challenged his sentence multiple times. In May 2008, he argued at the High Court that a whole life tariff violated his human rights, but the appeal was rejected. A second appeal later that year was similarly unsuccessful. In 2013, the European Court of Human Rights initially ruled that whole life sentences breached human rights, but Hutchinson lost a further appeal in February 2015. The court held that such sentences are acceptable, provided they are reviewed within 25 years. Hutchinson continued to challenge his sentence, and his case was referred to the Grand Chamber of the European Court of Human Rights in June 2015. On 17th January 2017, the Grand Chamber upheld the UK's right to impose whole-life orders in appropriate cases. John Francis Duffy, born 1958, and David Mulcahy, born 1959, were British criminals responsible for a series of gapes and murders targeting women and children near railway stations in southern England during the 1980s. Their crimes earned them the nicknames the Railway Killers, with Duffy often referred to as the Railway Murderer by the media. Duffy and Mulcahy were lifelong friends from North London, who shared a disturbing fascination with violence from a young age. While still at school, they were expelled for cruelty to animals, foreshadowing their later crimes. The pair began their attacks in 1982, gaping women near railway stations in and around North London. Over the next few years, their assaults continued, increasing in frequency and severity. Their crimes culminated in several murders, including that of 19-year-old Alison Day in December 1985. Day was abducted near Hackney Wick Station, sexually assaulted, forced across live railway tracks, and ultimately strangled with her blouse. Her body was weighted with stones and disposed of in the River Lea. The murders escalated with the killing of 15-year-old Marcia Tamboza in Surrey in April 1986. She was knocked from her bicycle with a wire, gaped, beaten with a rock, strangled, and her body set on fire. Soon after, 29-year-old Anne Locke was abducted and murdered at Brookmans Park railway station. Police struggled to identify the attackers, as forensic science at the time lacked DNA analysis. Victims described Duffy as a smaller, ginger-haired man and Mulcahy as a larger accomplice. Investigators brought in psychologist David Cantor, who pioneered offender profiling in the UK, analysing crime scenes to predict the perpetrator's traits, habits, and behaviours. Cantor's work helped focus the investigation and shaped future criminal profiling in Britain. Duffy was identified as a suspect in 1986 due to his criminal record, martial arts background, and detailed knowledge of the railway system, which matched the crimes. Items found at his home linked him to Marcia Tamboza's murder, and several victims positively identified him. Mulcahy, though known to police, initially avoided charges due to insufficient evidence. Duffy was arrested on the 26th of November 1986. He was tried in February 1988 and convicted of 2 murders and 4 gapes. Anne Locke's murder could not be fully prosecuted at that time due to a lack of forensic evidence. Duffy received a life sentence with a 30-year minimum tariff, later upgraded to a whole life tariff by the Home Secretary. In the late 1990s, Duffy began cooperating fully with authorities, giving detailed confessions and describing the involvement of Mulcahy. He explained how the pair refined their methods over time, gaining control over their victims with chilling precision. Duffy's confessions allowed police to connect him and Mulcahy to numerous unsolved gapes and murders. Mulcahy was arrested in February 1999 after surveillance, and DNA testing confirmed his involvement. In 2000, he was tried and convicted of 3 murders and 7 gapes, receiving multiple life sentences. Duffy also received additional sentences for his role in 17 offences of gape and conspiracy to gape, though he was already serving a life term. Neither man is expected to be released. The case of Duffy and Mulcahy demonstrated the effectiveness of offender profiling in complex serial crimes. George Norman Johnson, 47, is a convicted murderer who killed 89-year-old Florence May Habesh in her home in Rhyl, Denbighshire. Johnson, an odd job man, had previously been jailed for life in 1986 for a violent murder in Wolverhampton, in which he and another man killed a man during a robbery with knives and scissors. He had been released on license in 2006, but repeatedly failed to adhere to conditions, using heroin and accruing debts with local drug dealers. On 6 February, under the influence of heroin and crack cocaine, Johnson visited Mrs. Habesh, a church-going widow who had shown him kindness, and beat her to death with a heavy projector case as she made him a cup of tea. He stole £25 and some jewellery and struck her again to ensure she would not survive. The attack was deliberate, unprovoked, and fueled by drugs and the desire for money. He later involved his nephew to buy drugs with the stolen cash and admitted his crime to his brother, who contacted police. A pathologist determined Mrs. Habesh likely died late that night or the following morning. At Mould Crown Court, Mr. Justice Griffith Williams sentenced Johnson to life imprisonment, ordering that he should never be released, describing him as a dangerous criminal, as a very dangerous man, when under the influence of alcohol or drugs. Police and community members highlighted the betrayal of trust, noting that Mrs. Habesh had been a gentle, active and dignified member of the church community who had befriended Johnson. The case also prompted reviews of the probation and recall systems, examining why Johnson had not been recalled earlier despite his history of violent offending and drug abuse. The judge emphasized that Johnson alone was responsible for his actions, and that the attack on Mrs. Habesh was a particularly cowardly and vicious crime against a frail and vulnerable woman. In July 1982, Norma Richards, 27, and her 2 daughters, Samantha, 9, and Siretta, 7, were brutally murdered at their home in Dalston, East London. The killings went unsolved for 28 years until Wilbert Dyce, 54, of Forest Gate, was convicted at the Old Bailey following a cold case review prompted by a journalist investigating footballer Laurie Cunningham's family. Norma Richards had been the partner of Cunningham's brother, Keith, who was away in Spain at the time of the murders. On the day of the killings, Dyce followed Norma Richards home, gaped her, and stabbed her repeatedly. Fearing that one of the children may have woken up, he killed Samantha by stabbing her 8 times and drowned Siretta. In an attempt to mislead investigators, Dyce daubed National Front symbols on walls and doors. Norma Richards was found naked and stabbed while her daughters were discovered in a bath of cold water. Her youngest daughter, 4-year-old Rodine Cunningham, was staying with her grandmother that weekend and discovered the bodies. Dyce had been a minor acquaintance of the family and a known sexual predator, but he had not been suspected of the murders at the time. Advances in DNA technology during the cold case review ultimately led to his identification and arrest. At trial, Aftab Jafferji QC, prosecuting, described Dyce's actions as deliberate and chilling, highlighting the premeditated nature of the attacks. Judge Anthony Morris sentenced Dyce to 3 life terms with a whole life order, stating that the offences were of unspeakable brutality and utmost gravity and that he had shown no remorse. Detective Chief Inspector Stephen Lawrence described Dyce as an evil, violent man who preys on the weak and vulnerable, and noted that he had never accepted responsibility for his crimes. Stephen Unwin and William McFall, 2 convicted murderers who first met behind bars, were handed whole life sentences after torturing and killing 28-year-old nail technician Kwain Ngoc Nguyen in a crime described by the judge as monstrous. The pair lured Nguyen to Unwin's home in Shiny Row, near Sunderland, where they subjected her to hours of torment in a bid to force her bank details. Unwin then gaped her before the men forced her into her Audi, doused it in petrol, and set it alight while she was still alive. Firefighters later found her charred body in the back of the vehicle. The brutality of the murder was compounded by the men's criminal histories. Both had previously killed before, yet were freed on license years earlier. Unwin had murdered retired pharmacist John Greenwell on Christmas Day in 1998, killing him during a burglary and setting fire to his house to cover his tracks before being released in 2012. McFall, a violent burglar from Northern Ireland, had bludgeoned 86-year-old Martha Gilmore with a hammer in 1996 when she caught him in her home and was freed in 2010. The 2 killers met in HMP Swaleside, Kent, while serving their original life sentences. During sentencing at Newcastle Crown Court, Mr. Justice Morris called Unwin a calculating, manipulating and ruthless killer, and branded McFall an extremely violent man capable of monstrous behaviour. Nguyen's family were left devastated, with her sister describing the killers as evil and questioning how such dangerous men were ever released. Nguyen, who had come to the UK in 2010 to study business, had hoped to build a better life for her 2 children, but instead fell victim to the men's cruelty. Thomas Alexander Mair, an unemployed gardener with long-standing ties to far-right extremist groups, was sentenced to life imprisonment with a whole life order for the murder of Labour MP Jo Cox in June 2016. Mair ambushed Cox outside a library in Birstall, West Yorkshire, shooting her 3 times and stabbing her repeatedly while shouting nationalist slogans such as "Britain First" and "This is for Britain." The attack, which took place as Cox was on her way to meet constituents, was later described by the trial judge as a politically motivated act of terrorism intended to advance white supremacist and neo-Nazi ideology. Mair had immersed himself in fascist and extremist literature for years, owning Nazi regalia, bomb-making manuals, and publications from both British and American far-right organizations, including the National Front and National Vanguard. Investigators also found he had researched white supremacist figures, mass shootings, and the Norwegian terrorist Anders Behring Breivik. Although Mair had a history of mental health problems, psychiatric assessments concluded he was fully responsible for his actions at the time of the killing. During his trial at the Old Bailey, Mair refused to enter a plea and offered no defense. Witnesses testified that he had declared his actions were to keep Britain independent. He was convicted in November 2016 after a jury deliberated for just 90 minutes. In sentencing him, the judge made clear that the murder was an act of violent extremism, noting Mair's belief in white nationalism and his long-standing hatred of politicians he regarded as traitors. By imposing a whole life order, the court ensured Mair will never be eligible for release. His conviction was officially classified as a terrorism offence, marking him as a domestic terrorist in the United Kingdom. Christopher Halliwell, a taxi driver from Swindon, was convicted of 2 brutal murders and is serving life imprisonment with a whole life order. His crimes first came to public attention in 2011, with the disappearance of 22-year-old Sian O'Callaghan, who was last seen leaving a nightclub in Swindon. Halliwell, 48 at the time, abducted her, and her body was later found in a shallow grave near Uffington, Oxfordshire. Police traced a green Toyota Avensis taxi linked to him and arrested Halliwell on the 24th of March 2011. He initially pleaded not guilty, but later admitted to O'Callaghan's murder at Bristol Crown Court in October 2012 and was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 25 years. Following his arrest, Halliwell led police to the body of Becky Godden Edwards, a 20-year-old woman who had been missing since 2002 or 2003. Due to procedural errors by the police, Halliwell's confession could not initially be used in court, delaying justice. He was eventually tried and found guilty of her murder in September 2016, receiving a whole life sentence, meaning he will never be released. Halliwell's crimes involved abduction and the murder of young women, often with the bodies concealed. After his convictions, law enforcement investigated potential links to several other unsolved cases, including the disappearances of Sally Ann John Julie Finley, Trevelyan Evans, Claudia Lawrence, and Linda Rizal, though no further charges have been made. Investigations later revealed serious police mishandling of his confessions and missed opportunities that could have brought Halliwell to justice sooner. Halliwell is considered highly dangerous, and his whole life sentence ensures that he will remain in prison for life. Stephen Griffiths was convicted of the brutal murders of 3 women in Bradford, West Yorkshire, between 2009 and 2010. The victims, all sex workers, were Susan Rushworth, who disappeared on the 22nd of June 2009, Shelley Armitage, last seen on the 26th of April 2010, and Suzanne Blamires, reported missing on the 21st of May 2010. Parts of Blamires' body were recovered from the River Aire in Shipley, along with tissue later identified as Armitage's, but Rushworth's remains were never found. Griffiths was arrested on the 24th of May 2010, and during his arrest, he infamously gave his name as the Crossbow Cannibal. At the time of his arrest, Griffiths was a 40-year-old postgraduate criminology student at the University of Bradford, working on a PhD in homicide studies. He pleaded guilty to all 3 murders on the 21st of December 2010, and Leeds Crown Court sentenced him to life imprisonment with a whole life order, ensuring he will never be eligible for parole. While in prison, Griffiths has attempted to take his own life multiple times and undertook a 120-day hunger strike in 2011, during which he avoided contact with others. Griffiths had a long history of violent behavior. At 17, he received a 3-year sentence for an unprovoked knife attack on a supermarket manager. In 1991, psychiatrists diagnosed him as a schizoid psychopath, and in 1992, he received a 2-year sentence for holding a knife to the throat of a young girl. While in custody, he admitted he had fantasized about becoming a murderer. Police had monitored Griffiths for 2 years prior to the Bradford killings due to concerns over his interest in dismemberment, but at the time of the murders, no antisocial behavior order was in place. Thomas Hamilton McDowell, born in 1977 in Ballymena, County Antrim, Northern Ireland, was convicted of murdering 37-year-old German trainee, Rabbi Andreas Hintz, in 2002. Hintz, a gifted linguist, had arrived in Britain in 2000 to train as a rabbi at Leobach College. On the night of the 3rd of July 2002, Hintz spent the evening drinking alone at the Black Cap, a gay bar in Camden, North London. After meeting McDowell, he left the bar with him and went to McDowell's flat on Bain Street in the early hours. McDowell knocked Hintz to the floor with a martial arts kick, then strangled him. He dismembered the body using a ripsaw, wrapped the parts in bin liners, and left them on a nearby street for rubbish collection. The summer heat accelerated decomposition, producing a foul smell that ultimately led to the discovery of Hintz's remains. Hintz's mother, Barbara, and cousin Claudia Boberman travelled from Germany to appeal for information about his whereabouts. McDowell was arrested and appeared at the Old Bailey in December 2002. At his September 2004 trial, it was revealed that McDowell had suffered abuse as a child, held a strong hatred of homosexuals, and had a personality disorder. He admitted manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. Suffolk Crown Court sentenced him to life imprisonment, with the judge recommending that he should never be released due to concerns about public safety. McDowell began his sentence at Rampton Secure Hospital in Nottinghamshire. On 22 May 2013, Lee Rigby, a 25-year-old British Army soldier, was brutally murdered near the Royal Artillery Barracks in Woolwich, southeast London. Rigby, off duty at the time, was walking along Wellington Street when he was struck by a car driven by Michael Olumide Adebolajo and Michael Oluwatobi Adebowale. The two men then attacked him with knives and a cleaver, dragging his body into the road and announcing to bystanders that the killing was revenge for Muslims killed in British military operations abroad. Unarmed police arrived within 9 minutes of the emergency call, setting up a cordon. Armed officers arrived shortly after, and both attackers charged at them with weapons. The police fired, wounding both men, who were then taken to hospital and subsequently charged. Adebolajo and Adebowale, both British nationals of Nigerian descent, who had converted to Islam from Christianity, were already known to British security services. Adebolajo had a history of radical Islamist activity. He converted to Islam in 2003. He became involved with the banned extremist group Al-Muhajirun and had been arrested in connection with violent protests and suspected attempts to travel abroad for militant training. Authorities in Kenya detained him in 2010, fearing he might join Al-Shabaab, but he was released to UK authorities without charges. Following the attack, Adebolajo was hospitalized, then charged with the murder of Rigby, attempted murder of police officers, and possession of a firearm. During his court proceedings, he asked to be known as Mujahid Abu Hamza. On the 19th of December 2013, he was convicted of Rigby's murder. On 26 February 2014, Adebolajo received a whole life sentence, meaning he will never be released, while Adebowale received a minimum term of 45 years. During sentencing, Adebolajo shouted, "Allahu Akbar," in the courtroom, displaying the extremist beliefs that had motivated the attack. Gary Smith and Lee Newell are British prisoners who were sentenced to whole life imprisonment for the brutal murder of a fellow inmate, Subhan Anwar, at Long Lartin High Security Prison in Worcestershire. Both men were already serving life sentences for previous killings. On 14th February, Smith and Newell followed 24-year-old Anwar into his cell. Using weapons improvised from a pen and a toothbrush, they bound his ankles with tape and strangled him with his own tracksuit bottoms. After the killing, Smith calmly made Newell a cup of hot chocolate before the men allowed prison guards into the cell. Anwar was found dead, and the attackers showed minimal emotion throughout the incident. The motive for the murder remains unclear, though the court noted a moral code in prisons, where inmates sometimes target those convicted of crimes against children. Anwar was serving a life sentence for the murder of his partner's 2-year-old child, Sanam Nafsaka. The jury took less than 4 hours to convict both Smith and Newell. Mr. Justice Jeremy Baker ruled that this was one of the exceptional cases warranting whole life sentences, stating, "There is in reality no mitigating factor in either of your cases. Neither man will ever be eligible for parole. Both refused to attend the full sentencing hearing." Lee Newell, serving a life sentence since the late 1980s for the murder of 56-year-old Mary Neal in Norwich. He strangled her and hid her body in a cupboard. Gary Smith, serving a life sentence since 1999 for murdering 22-year-old Ali Hassan, whose naked body he threw into a quarry. Smith believed Hassan was a police informer. In 2003, London was shaken by the kidnapping and murder of 5 members of the Chauhan family. Amarjit Chauhan, a successful freight businessman, vanished along with his wife Nancy, their 2 young sons, and Nancy's mother Charanjit Kaur. The bodies were initially buried in a field near Tiverton, Devon, before being dumped at sea off Dorset. While 3 of the adult victims were eventually recovered, the 2 children, aged 8 weeks and 18 months, were never found. The killings were linked to a financial motive. The perpetrators intended to take control of Chauhan's shipping company, allegedly to use it for drug trafficking. Kenneth, Regan and William Horncy were identified as the ringleaders behind the murders and received whole life sentences. Regan, a convicted drug dealer and former police informant, had worked briefly for Chauhan and exploited his connections to lure the family into a trap. Horncy, formerly an accountant, had a history of providing false identities for criminals. Both men were deeply involved in the logistics of the murders, from binding and drugging the family to burying the bodies and later dumping them at sea. A key piece of evidence was a note found hidden in Amarjit Chauhan's sock, which pointed directly to Regan as one of the perpetrators. The investigation was one of the most complex in Metropolitan Police history. After a massive manhunt across Europe, Regan was arrested in Belgium and Horncy, using the alias William Smith, was located in the Ardennes before being extradited to the UK. The 8-month trial at the Old Bailey was the longest in Metropolitan Police history, costing around £10 million. Both men were convicted on the 1st of July 2005. Peter Rees, a third accomplice, was sentenced to 23 years for his part in Amarjit Chauhan's murder and assisting the offenders, but was cleared of the other murders. The judge described the crimes as uniquely terrible, emphasizing the cold-blooded nature of murdering a baby and toddler alongside the adults